Hello, everyone, and welcome to this very special edition of Listening to America. I'm Clay Jenkinson. I'm sitting across, literally, physically, for the second time in my life, Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky, who, as you know, a very frequent and much-loved guest on the Listening to America podcast. And Lindsay, you and I last night gave a lecture here. We are actually on the property of Christ Church in Weems, Virginia, and we gave a lecture together about the religious clause of the First Amendment.
We did, and I was reflecting on this last night, that we were speaking from the pulpit and we were talking about the importance of religious freedom and occasionally being slightly irreverent, and I quoted, I think, West Wing, and
I was a little sorry about that, but that's fine.
It's essential. We're making history accessible to the people.
It's a text, yeah.
We talked about Washington's letter to the Touro Synagogue, and I was wondering if we were tempting fate, the wrath from high above with some lightning coming down and striking us in our place, but that did not happen, as we are still sitting here today, and it was a spectacular venue, and we are very grateful that they let us into it. So thank you so much for having us back.
Yeah, our subject today is Patrick Henry, 10 things about Patrick Henry. But before we do that, I just want to say hello to Robert Teagle. You are our host. You've been most gracious to us. I've had you print out gazillions of documents. Good crowd last night.
It was a great crowd, and we were so thrilled to have Lindsay come back. She spoke here last year on John Adams, and said, "I'll come back if I can speak in the church this time." And then I said, "Well, can you give me an invite to Clay?" And the rest is, as they say, history. But what a great evening, and the setting certainly is an ironic one, not only for what Lindsay said, but also the building was the height of the Church of England and the power, and there was, of course, no religious liberty there. So I'm excited to hear how Henry, what he thought about that as you all continue today.
Oh, very nice. Thank you, Robert. Really cool. We're in one of the other buildings on the site. I'd never seen the church before. In fact, I'd never been to the Northern Neck before. It's a marvelous, beautiful place in America. The church, I think, would pass muster with Jefferson architecturally. I don't know that he would be in favor of high Anglican anything, but architecturally, I think it begins to show the signs of the Augustan age in Britain, Palladianism, symmetry. It's a beautiful church, one of the most beautiful churches in the country. And so thank you for being our host. You're welcome to listen to this, and maybe you'll have to separate us. But, when Lindsay asked, she begged for a return visit, right?
Yes.
Yeah, of
That's
course.
exactly how it went.
Yeah, exactly. And then you said, "Great, can you get Clay Jenkinson?" I believe she said, "Dream higher, Robert, dream higher." But that's all right. I don't hold a grudge.
No, it was a fantastic program, and as you all were just saying, people came from Virginia Beach, from Surrey, and it's just such a special space. The building, it's Virginia's finest church, and one of America's great buildings, really. And I think the beauty of it is the lessons that are there. I'm partial to the religious liberty story, and because that building is the antithesis of that, and but it has a lot of lessons to offer, and you all made a very special evening last night. So thank you for everything you did.
You're very kind. Thank you so much, Robert.
As I was getting ready for this program last night, I was doing a little bit more research about the church, just so I made sure I had my facts right. And it is one of two churches that still has the existing high-backed pews, which we were able to see people because we were up high above in the pulpit. But those high-backed pews, man, they are intense, and they meant business, and were very much intended to keep people awake. The second thing is, it is the only church in North America that has the 3-tier pulpit surviving.
We humbly were on tier 1.
It was such a cool space.
It was a great space. All right, so I'm quoting something to you here.
Okay.
That religion, or the duty which we owe to our Creator, and the manner of discharging it, can be directed only by reason and conviction, not by force or violence. And therefore all men have an equal, natural, and unalienable right to the free exercise of religion, according to the dictates of conscience, and that no particular religious sect or society ought to be favored or established by law in preference to others. Who said that? You would think it would be...
It does sound an awful lot like Jefferson.
Or Madison.
Yes.
Guess what? It's Patrick Henry.
Ah.
And that's why I wanted to start with that. And I didn't mean to catch you off guard. I just wanted you to say what you did, which is that sounds like Thomas Jefferson. Because, and we've had this conversation before, but Jefferson had such enormous influence on historiography that his view of things has actually shaped how history has remembered people like Patrick Henry and
Yes.
John Adams and others. And Jefferson could be snarky.
Yes.
And I asked myself last night after our conversation, did Jefferson hate Patrick Henry? And, the hate is a strong word for Jefferson, but I think, yes, he did. And he tainted him because I'll quote some of Jefferson's things that he said about Patrick Henry, but because he's the author of the Virginia Statutes for Religious Liberty and is like the greatest person who ever espoused those views, he made it seem as if Henry was a backward-looking conservative who was trying to hold the line against religious liberty, and it's not true at all.
Mm-hmm.
Henry, that statement is worthy of Jefferson. In fact, you wonder if Jefferson may have borrowed a little from it, right?
It does sound a little similar.
Actually, it comes 3 years after Jefferson's statute. But you take my point that Jefferson said that Henry was the laziest reader of any man he ever knew.
That's surely a little bit of an exaggeration.
But not much. It's because Jefferson lent Henry a book. And he didn't like to lend anybody books, but he lends Henry this book. Henry takes it back to one of his many houses in the backwoods, and he returns it like years later.
Oh, that's so funny.
Jefferson had to ask for it.
Oh, no.
And then he returns it, and Jefferson said not only was it soiled, had it been not well taken care of, which is a sin for Jefferson, but he said, and you know about how the pages were printed in that area. He said the pages hadn't even been cut. So Henry hadn't even read it. But he kept it for this prolonged period and returned it soiled. For like Jefferson, that's like, I cannot be your friend. And so he has all these statements. And then I'll just give you one more. He said, I used to listen to him, and he spoke as Homer must have written, and he was spellbinding and inspiring, and you were just swept up in his eloquence and the sublimity of his expression. But he said, and afterwards you couldn't remember what he said because it was just like all rhetoric and fluff. We know those aren't fair assessments of Patrick Henry.
Yeah, so let's give a little bit of backstory before we take down Jefferson's assessment of Patrick Henry. He was born on May 29th, 1736 in Studley, Virginia. He spent most of his life in Virginia and was a lawyer, was a slave owner, was a plantation owner. He probably lived in what we would think of today sort of as like a hotel or like a bed and breakfast on a main thoroughfare while he was studying for law, which was owned by his father-in-law. So sometimes later he was tarnished as being a tavern keeper.
Jefferson called him a tavern. He said he was a bartender.
Which is not really accurate. And he died in June 6th, 1799. So he was very much a man of Virginia. One of the main questions for historians is why isn't he better remembered? He certainly is remembered for his famous "Give me liberty or give me death" speech. But why isn't he remembered for more? There are a couple of different answers.
One is Jefferson.
One certainly is Jefferson. That Jefferson had a huge hand in deciding how people from the early republic were remembered. Not just Virginians, not just people he hated. Though, side note, he did seem to have a special animosity for certain Virginians. If they were Virginians, they were more likely to, I think, bear the brunt of his anger.
Yes, because if, for example, John Marshall
betrayed
the
Marshall.
revolution and became a vile Federalist and cozied up to John Adams and became a centralizing interpreter of the Constitution, for Jefferson, that's like treason against Virginia.
Well, it's interesting because we'll get into sort of Patrick Henry's evolution as well, but I do wonder to a certain extent of it, if you are a Virginian and you eventually espouse a different view of the Constitution, then you are dead to Jefferson.
And Madison, but Madison's more reluctant than Jefferson to go after these people.
It's my sense that he's less hateful towards the Virginians. Like, he hates other people, but he's less hateful towards the Virginians because it's not as much of like a personal betrayal as it was for Henry. So those are sort of the basic facts for Henry. He served most of his adult life in public service. He was mostly involved in the state legislature or the colonial legislature and then the state legislature, which is the second potential reason that he was not remembered. He was never really in national office. I should say he was also governor of Virginia for 5 different terms. So he was never in Congress. He was never on the Supreme Court. He was never in the administration. He was never president. Though, spoiler alert, and we will get to this because one of the items on my list is the things he turned down.
A lot. He turned down chances to run for the presidency, to be Secretary of State, etc. So he's not as much of a national figure as, say, John Adams or George Washington. He's an exact contemporary of Washington's. He was born a little bit before Jefferson. Jefferson early on kind of looked up to him as this sort of charismatic violinist and fiddler, this orator, this man for whom women kind of got into his orbit because they found him so fascinating to listen to. And he was a storyteller and charming, all the things that Thomas Jefferson, the shy introvert, was not. He was at the First Continental Congress, but that was really his only national presence.
And that was a very short session.
So let me just ask you this question as we begin our discussion of Henry. My view has always been that he was great at tearing down the British colonial imperialism, but that he didn't have a lot of positive contributions to make to building a new polity in America.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I mean, I think once he was, I think certainly his experience in Virginia encouraged him to think differently about the importance of power and how it might be used, because when he was governor of Virginia, when he was governor for 5 terms, he certainly used as much power as he possibly could, even though that position was quite limited. And I think at times he was quite critical of the state constitution for how limiting it was on executive authority. So it wasn't that he was opposed to strong government, it's just that he was often opposed to strong national government. He wanted much stronger state executive power. In his position as governor, I do think he had a building influence because he had so many terms, but you're right that he wasn't necessarily instrumental in the crafting of documents that would provide the infrastructure needed to build something new.
We need to take a short break. I'm talking with my dear friend, Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky. We are at Christ Church in Weems, Virginia, in the Northern Neck. We had a great night last night with the people of this district, and some came from some distances, with shouts of "More Lindsay, more Lindsay, more Lindsay." We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, I want to go back to the issue of Jefferson's governorship. You are listening to a special edition in the field of Listening to America. Welcome back to this special edition of Listening to America. Lindsay, it's so good to see you for the second time, first in Vail, Colorado, where we debated who was the indispensable president, Washington or Jefferson, and I'm very sorry to say you won by acclamation from the good citizens of Vail. Washington, not Jefferson, the indispensable man. Last night, we got along pretty well up there in the pulpit, and we were talking about the religious clause of the First Amendment. So you ended our first segment in a really interesting way. Jefferson was governor when the state was twice invaded. The Constitution made the governorship a very weak position. Jefferson's character was to read the office in a narrow, careful, understated sort of way. That's who he was at that time. He wasn't a warrior, never fired a rifle in anger in his life. And he, I think, overcompensated for his abhorrence of monarchy by doing only those things he thought could legitimately be included in his job description. Fair enough. But Virginia needed strong leadership. In an emergency, you just have to have the leadership, and Jefferson didn't have it. And because of that, 2 things. One is that when he became president, he wasn't going to make that mistake again. He turned out to be a very strong president when he needed to be. And so he learned his lesson from that debacle. It was the greatest shame of his life. He left almost fled the governorship in June of 1781. I mean, he abandoned it effectively. The second thing, Lindsay, is that why did Jefferson hate Patrick Henry? Because then the House of Delegates of Virginia passed a resolution to examine the conduct of the executive during this crisis. And Jefferson felt that that was an appalling assault on his character. And of course, as you know, in the 18th century, character was everything, honor. And so it wasn't, he said, I don't mind if it's about errors of the head. Anyone can screw up. But if they are accusing me of errors of the heart, And he then later told Madison that he would never recover from this until the all-healing grave. So there's a little bit of self-pity and all of that. But
Just a smidge.
Just a smidge, but you understand. But he understood rightly that behind the resolution into his conduct was Patrick Henry. And he never forgave that. That was no. I mean, he didn't have to like Henry. They didn't have to like each other, but they could be fellow advocates in the same cause. But when Henry was the motive force, Jefferson thought, behind this investigation, that meant that he would never again trust Henry.
Correct. And he never did. And they were often at loggerheads for the rest of their life. You know, it's interesting. There were huge patches where I don't think they really interacted much. And then there are these periods of time where they come into conflict. And I know we'll talk about a few more of them as we go through our list.
Let's hear something from your list.
From my list. So, gosh, it's so hard to choose. One of the most interesting things I think about Patrick Henry, and this is true of some Virginians, is their relationship with Washington. So they could be politically more inclined to the Democratic Republicans, but they were Virginians, I think, first and foremost, and they were often quite independent in their thinking, and so they had just tremendous loyalty to Washington. This is true of Patrick Henry. This is true of the Lee family. Henry had a really interesting relationship with Washington, which developed during the war because he was one of the first governors to respond to Washington's call for aid during the winter of Valley Forge.
And he sent horses and
Food,
uniforms and food.
Clothing, shoes when the army was really on the verge of teetering into collapse, and so Washington was incredibly grateful to him.
And the Conway Cabal.
That's where I was going next.
Yeah, exactly. So he secured his relationship with Washington forever.
Yes.
So tell us what the Cabal was and Henry's role in it.
So the Conway Cabal is named after Thomas Conway, who was I believe originally a British officer?
He's Irish.
Irish, okay. An officer who had come over and offered his services to the Continental Army, who wanted a high-powered commission, was probably had a seriously overinflated sense of self-importance. And he was one of many officers who, after the Battle of Saratoga, when General Gates had an enormous amount of success, started to question whether Washington, who had had a number of defeats at that point, should be the commander-in-chief of the army.
Just to add to that for a moment, Lindsay, so Washington had just given up Philadelphia to the British.
Yes.
So
and Congress had to flee.
A major, major blow to the American cause. You know, some people thought that would end the war in Britain's favor. Meanwhile, Gates up at Saratoga wins a stunning battle against the British, and people begin to say, Washington doesn't seem to win these things. He doesn't really even seem to want to fight. Here's Gates, Horatio Gates, who's doing these extraordinary things. Maybe we've got the wrong guy.
So this cabal, which probably was never as well organized as the word cabal suggests, was probably a few people from the Board of War in Congress, which was the committee that was charged with overseeing the war effort, a few of the general officers, and then some other people in the Philadelphia area. And the practice during the war was often, if you were sending a letter to someone and you didn't want it intercepted, you wouldn't sign your name, expecting that the person you were sending it to would recognize your handwriting and know who you were. And Benjamin Rush, who was sometimes a rabble-rouser for good, he brought Adams and Jefferson back together in 1812, but also sometimes a rabble-rouser for drama, sent Patrick Henry a letter saying that, Washington should be replaced, and basically revealing that these conversations were taking place.
So I was shocked when I read this. And so he writes this letter saying, among other things, the military hospitals are a disaster. We are not treating the wounded American veterans very well. And he says that maybe it's time to replace Washington, but he doesn't sign this. But in the letter, he hints 3 or 4 times about who he is.
And partly the criticism he had wanted to have more control over the if I'm remembering this incident correctly, he had wanted to have more control over the military hospitals, and Washington had sort of not given him the influence he wanted. He also was while this is way before the rise of anti-federalists, federalists, but there were different personalities at the time, and you could kind of see the factions of personalities, and he was in that faction of personality that was going to be what eventually sort of became the Anti-Federalists. So he writes this letter to Patrick Henry. Patrick Henry did not recognize his handwriting, did not know who it was, but sent it to Washington.
So Henry immediately sends this incendiary letter on to the general.
To Washington, as a demonstration of his loyalty to this commander. Washington does recognize the writing. He knows who this is. Washington never forgave Rush. He did not have it out with him publicly, but he never trusted him again.
Didn't trust him again.
Yes, and did not. Again, Washington was fine if you criticized him to his face. He could take you yelling at him. He could take you telling him he was wrong. But if you criticized him publicly, meaning sending letters about it or printing it, then you were done.
You could be Hamilton and confront him personally.
Yes.
But if you're writing secret letters behind his back, as Jefferson eventually did, it's over.
It's done. Which in some ways I actually find quite commendable, because he could take the criticism. It's more of the duplicity that bothered him.
So how gentlemen behave.
Exactly. So anyway, he gets this letter. He knows who it is, and he did not take action during the cabal, but he puts his minions on it, and his minions are Alexander Hamilton and the Marquis de Lafayette and some of his other aides de camp and some of his other lower level generals, and they basically snuff it out. And in the snuffing out, Congress reaffirms their commitment and their belief in and their trust in Washington, and it is the last real threat to his command.
So John Kukla, an author who is a friend of mine and has a beautiful biography of Patrick Henry and another great book on the Louisiana Purchase, says that this crisis, as you say, cabal might be too strong a word, but this crisis wound up actually consolidating Washington's leadership, and he gained from the crisis rather than lost from it.
He did, especially because he didn't react publicly. So it looked like he was above it and above the scheming, which was generally a good posture for him to take. And what Kukla also says is that weeks before his death, Washington is still writing about this moment and his appreciation of Henry and his loyalty to Henry.
He's writing about the cabal.
Yes.
There's a thin-skinned man there, too.
What is that,
20-some
years later. So it's both thin-skinnedness, but also he prized loyalty, really prized personal loyalty. And so was not something he forgot.
So, first of all, Conway soon leaves and goes back to England.
He also, doesn't he die? Doesn't he fall into the river and die?
Not here.
I thought he fell into the river on his horse. Maybe he got sick.
We'll look that up during the next break.
I'm making this story more dramatic.
We go. So this is not about George Washington. Today is about Patrick Henry. Let me just ask you this question about Washington. The argument can be made that he wasn't a very effective general at this point in the war, that he stalled, he was having a hard time holding his troops together, as anyone would have, of course. That they never had enough of anything, hay, horses, wagons, you name it, ammunition for that matter. And that it's not totally irrational to think maybe he's not the best person to protect American interests at this critical moment.
Yeah, the criticism of him was not totally misplaced, because he had made strategic blunders. He had made battle plans that would have worked if you had a seasoned and disciplined and very experienced army, which he did not. Sometimes they were too complex for them to execute. Early on, he misunderstood what the overall purpose of his army was, in particular that his goal was not to fight and win big battles, it was to survive.
You outlast the British.
Yes, outlast.
That's all you need to do.
So over time, he did develop a sense of that, and partly it's also, Congress was a little bit unclear early on about how much leeway they were willing to give him to craft the strategic vision, how much he needed to defer to them on battle plans. That became much clearer. They were very explicit, basically saying, do what you think is best. And he got much more comfortable with what we would think of as sort of like the skirmish model of fighting a war, with the purpose being to survive and to not be captured. But I think long term, where his greatness is shown is that understanding that as long as he is with the army is in one piece, and the character of the army is enough to try and win the hearts and minds of the people, then that's what he has to do. And that does show a great deal of restraint and wisdom. But as a battle tactician, master, or as a strategic thinker, he wasn't great at seeing the battlefield.
And Gates had great good fortune up at Saratoga.
Largely thanks to Benedict Arnold.
Right, who then was in a whole different...
We should do 10 things on Benedict Arnold.
We should, but let me do one of the 10 things on Patrick Henry's first wife, Sarah. So he's married twice. He has 17 children.
Good heavens.
Total. 11 by wife 2, 6 by wife 1. And after she gave birth to her 6th child in 1771, she had postpartum psychosis, as she's now been diagnosed, and became so mentally unstable at a time when we really had no way of addressing this sort of thing. These people were usually just put in asylums and just left to rot in squalor, and sometimes chained up. But he wouldn't allow her to go to an asylum. He kept her at home. He built a special cabin or special place for her to convalesce. But for a period of time, she was in a straitjacket. And when you read that, it kind of breaks your heart.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about just how horrible this is from a 21st century point of view.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard for us kind of to fathom, because it obviously is a part of life and death, but there was just such a lack of understanding about how, both about how science works. So as you said, like the concept of germ theory is not a thing at that point. And they didn't understand the possibility of infection, their ability to, today if you have challenges in childbirth, their ability to, for example, staunch bleeding is much better than it was back then. They didn't have C-sections, so depending on how the child was positioned, you were often out of luck.
Breech might kill you.
Yeah, breech could kill you. In some ways, actually, as medicine became more professionalized, there was a period of time where that was actually quite detrimental to women, because for a long time, women's health and childbirth had been really the prerogative of midwives and other women. And of course, while they were not professionals today, like we think of OBGYNs, they often had a much better understanding.
They knew what they were doing.
They knew what they were doing, and they also had the experience, whereas a lot of male physicians did not know what they were doing and did not have the experience, and pushed midwives out of that practice. So childbirth was quite deadly. We're surrounded by, in the room we're in, there are a number of the old preserved gravestones from the original church. And there's
Christ Church in Williams,
Virginia. And there is a tombstone of Betty Carter, the wife, the second wife of Robert Carter, behind you, and she died in childbirth. And it was extremely common.
Jefferson's wife dies birthing her last child.
And so I think if we think of in particular of Patrick Henry's wife, if it's her 6th child, you're having children in close proximity to one another. There's no effective birth control. If there is damage from one previous birth, the likelihood that they can do anything about it is...
Can't repair a uterus.
There's no repair. All the things that they suggested to women to prepare were actually quite detrimental. So if you're locking yourself away, that's really bad for anyone's psychology.
You need to be out walking instead, right?
Yeah, you need movement,
right.
You need fresh air, you need sunlight, all of the things that we encourage today for mental health, they were doing the opposite of.
It's horrifying. At this time, when these women were suffering so grievously, there really was nothing to do but endure it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and if you're lucky and you have a husband like Patrick Henry who was supportive and kind, that's the best you can get.
Sarah dies, he marries another woman, and that 11 children from that second round.
Too many children.
They didn't all live to, I think, died young, but that's a lot of Henrys out there in the world.
A lot of Henrys, yeah.
The second thing I wanted to ask you, and we just have a minute before we go to our break here, but it's about primogeniture. So Jefferson famously attacked primogeniture, which is that the estate goes to the eldest male child when there's no will stating otherwise. Jefferson said that he laid the axe to these medieval feudalisms of primogeniture and entail, and he did, as when he revised the law code of Virginia. But Henry comes into his adulthood a little before that, and he had an older half-brother who has inherited everything. And so now Henry has nothing under primogeniture, and so that's why he had to scramble in a tavern running a kind of Airbnb. That's why he had to run a little store. Then he self-taught himself law. He read, Jefferson, again, in hateful way, said, I studied 5 years to take the bar exam in Virginia. Henry studied in a desultory fashion for 6 weeks. And Jefferson said George Wythe, his beloved mentor, refused to sign the license for Henry because he said, this guy has not done the work. But Henry turned out to be one of the
Pretty great
trial lawyers of all time.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, so this is one of the real differences between British society and American society, which is this concept of primogeniture, which is that you want to try and keep the great estates in one piece. Many Americans felt that this was, too aristocratic. It was too un-American, and so they did not do that. And so they would often split up their estate into multiple pieces, which was one of the reasons you had the mad scramble for more land in the West and expansion and settlement on native lands, because there were sons that were receiving a little bit but not really enough to grow wealth, and so they were always looking for more as a way to grow their estate. But George Washington is another example where he had 2 older half brothers that, had they survived, he would be a footnote in a history book, because he would have had no money. He might have gone into the Navy. He would have been the British Navy. He would have been a nothing, but because he inherited money, and of course his older brothers died, and he did make himself sort of a success through other means, he became someone that he would not have otherwise.
Amazing to think about that. We need to take a short break. I'm having a great time talking with you about Patrick Henry. My list is long. I think yours is too. It's so much fun to be across the table from Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky, which is a couple of hours from your place as the executive director of the Washington Presidential Library. We will be back in just a moment. Welcome back to this special edition of Listening to America. Lindsay Chervinsky is sitting across from me. It's such a treat. Let's go to the Constitution of the United States, shall we?
Yes.
So Patrick Henry wasn't there, nor was Thomas Jefferson at the Constitutional Convention, nor was your man John Adams. 3 of the great luminaries of the era were not present at that moment. And historians usually say it's good that Jefferson wasn't there, because he would have tried to radicalize all this stuff, and Jefferson probably would have been a bit of and John Adams would have been a nuisance, because he couldn't not say what was on his mind, and he always had many things on his mind, many of them snarky. So Henry had a chance to go. He famously said he wouldn't go because, quote, he smelt a rat. What does that mean, Lindsay?
So the call for I was just thinking as you're saying all 3 didn't go, but they all really made their influence known in one way or the other, and we'll get to that. But so when there was a call for this convention, it wasn't to write a new constitution. It was to discuss ways that the articles might be revised to make them more effective. And he understood very early on that that was probably not what was going to end up happening. And he didn't feel that a new constitution was appropriate in this manner. That if there was to be a new constitution, then it had to be articulated from the very beginning and called by the people from the very beginning.
So he felt that they were going to not do what they were entitled to do, that
Yes.
they were going to break the Constitution rather
Yes.
than repair it.
Yes. And he was right. The first thing they did on the first day was decide to basically throw out the Articles of Confederation and start a new plan. And I don't know for sure, but I suspect that at many times when they were debating certain clauses and they were trying to make compromises, I'm quite certain that he was in the back of Madison's mind as a potential force down the road that he would have to grapple with for ratification and the various concerns that he might have. Similarly, of course, Jefferson was a force in Madison's mind, and they were exchanging letters. And we talked last night about Jefferson's impact on Madison's thinking about the amendments and the importance of having a Bill of Rights. And of course, John Adams made his influence known, A, because he drafted the Massachusetts State Constitution, which was one of the models of that was, I think, borrowed from for the national constitution, and B, because that summer he was writing his defenses of the Constitution.
Massive tome.
Massive.
But they all were reading it.
Yeah, and it wasn't because it wasn't published in a massive tome initially. It was published in serial form. And so the serial form was coming out over the course of the summer as they were in the convention, and Philadelphia was one of the great centers of publishing in the United States. So they were turning these pamphlets out, including a pamphlet on the power of the executive came out the same day Madison planned to give, a big speech about the executive, and apparently he was quite annoyed that Adams stole a little bit of his thunder.
Oh, that's so cool. So interesting. I just thought of this, but all three of them, John Adams, Patrick Henry, and Thomas Jefferson, had already written constitutions for their states. They were constitution writers, and they were known as constitution writers. Now, Jefferson typically did his alone, sent it in after the fact. People had to bend over backwards to incorporate it. It's so Jefferson that he never shows up. He always sends something down the mountain with somebody else. It's always a little bit late. And then in every instance, they say, oh, okay, we got to take Jefferson seriously. Adams had a huge role in the Massachusetts Constitution, and Henry had played a significant role in Virginia's development of its. So these are three people who know something about writing constitutions, and none of them is there.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. And Madison, who was a deep student of constitutions, had not yet written one,
right,
and yet became, I think Gouverneur Morris deserves a lot of credit, but certainly Madison and Morris are the two big forces behind our current constitution.
Don't you love it that Henry said he smelt a rat? Jefferson would have never said that. Washington, no. Adams wouldn't have said that. But it's so Henry.
Well, and one of the things, we haven't really talked too much about his oratory, but he was an incredible orator because he could speak in language that was compelling to people. I mean, it wasn't always the high-minded rhetoric of a Jefferson, but it was rhetoric that spoke to people where they were. And I think Kukla was the one that said that, he could read the room really well. So he could adjust his approach, he could adjust his language, he could adjust his argument depending on who he was speaking to. And the greatest speakers can do that, because it's one thing to prepare a brilliant speech, but not all audiences are the same. I know that this is something, you've spoken to a gazillion audiences, I've spoken to a bunch.
You got to read the room.
You have to read the room, and you have to change your approach, you have to change your energy, you have to change your emphasis depending on where you are, who you're speaking to, and how they're feeling on any given day.
We only have a few minutes left, but I want to ask you about John Adams and Patrick Henry. I don't know much about that. What was their relationship?
I don't know that they were particularly close or that they had a whole lot of interaction. I mean, they would have obviously met at the First Continental Congress when they were present. But other than that, Henry spent most of his life in Virginia, and Adams spent almost no time in Virginia. They certainly were of a like mind early in the Revolution. Many people talked about Patrick Henry being sort of the Virginia version of Samuel Adams, as being one of the rabble-rousers and an early adopter of some of the resistance movements. And so certainly they would have been on the same page. Adams was very supportive of the ratification of the Constitution, so they would have found themselves at odds there. But certainly Adams respected Henry's contributions enough to nominate him as an envoy. He would not have done so if he did not feel that his loyalty was absolute. And one of the later moments of towards the end of Henry's life that I think is so fascinating is in the 1798 congressional elections. John Marshall was running for Congress. This was another person that George Washington said, you must run for Congress. Washington was sort of single-handedly trying to change the congressional delegation from Virginia. And Marshall, he said no to him a bunch of times. I think I've told this story on a previous episode, but said no to him a bunch of times, and finally was trying to sneak out of Mount Vernon, and Washington standing there in full uniform with a dress sword.
He suited up.
And so that Marshall couldn't leave without seeing him, and was also in military uniform and couldn't say no to his commander-in-chief. And so he's like, oh, fine, I'll run for Congress. So he ran for Congress. It was an incredibly competitive race, and one of the main factors that probably swung in his favor was that Marshall came out and endorsed him. Sorry, not Marshall. one of the main factors in his favor for winning was that Patrick Henry came out and endorsed him towards the end. And that endorsement was essential because this was in the midst of the big fight over the Alien and Sedition Acts. And so Henry's credentials as an anti-federalist had been unimpeachable. And so his support for Marshall was huge.
And I read last night in Kukla's excellent biography of Patrick Henry that Henry was really disturbed by the Alien and Sedition Acts, that he was a true lover of liberty and against encroachment by government, especially a central national government. But he stayed quiet about it because he didn't want, that wasn't the fight he was going to take on, but he was really uneasy with it. And now, of course, the Alien Enemies Act is back in the news in the United States of America. So,
well, and what's interesting about his endorsement of Marshall is even though Marshall was running as a Federalist, Marshall had been an outspoken critic of the Alien Sedition Acts, which is, I think, one of the reasons Henry was willing to endorse him.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about generations here. So I'm a generation older than you are. I think that's to put it nicely. But I'm a generation older than you are. And so when I was coming up, Jefferson was king, was like the greatest of the founding fathers, and then, everyone paled beside him and so on. Your generation, and you particularly, don't buy that trope at all. Then the generation before me was this kind of super patriotic view of this, and so that's just a lead up to the two statements by Henry. One is, give me liberty or give me death. When I thought about that last night, I thought, well, that's a pretty big statement, right? I mean, first of all, we don't even know if it's absolutely true, but assuming that it's true, it seems a little over the top, doesn't it? Give me liberty or give me death?
Well, as you said, we don't have a great record of what was often said in these addresses because there were no recordings.
Remembered 30 or 40 years later.
Remembered later. And if people, sometimes people would leave like a written note of what they said, but even then that's often imperfect because people would, change on the fly as we do today. So we don't really know. But, I also have to think in the dramatic moment of what it means to have a revolution when you're talking about these things and when you're contemplating taking action that could be considered treasonous, and especially when you get into the war aspect of it. So when you're talking about people like, Nathaniel Hale, I regret that I have but one life to give for my country.
Are you kidding?
He was about to be hung. So, like, the drama was pretty, that one's a little bit on the nose.
That's more visceral.
So, I do think that the stakes were heightened. And sometimes their use of language is more dramatic in ways, often when they are describing their affection for people, we're like, that's a little exaggerated. So I think maybe it's a certain cultural element and maybe it's the stakes of the moment. But yes, it is quite dramatic.
I expect a little Lindsay eye roll on that one. So the other thing that he said was this famous moment where he's talking in the Burgesses and he says, now Caesar had his Brutus and Charles I had his Cromwell and George III. And then people cried, treason, treason, treason. Don't say it, don't say it. Then he said, may he learn from this example. Isn't that cool?
That's really good.
Caesar had his
really
Caesar had
good.
his Brutus.
I love that.
Charles I had his Cromwell, and George III. Pause. They're all saying, "Don't say it."
So that's one of those moments, the theatrical element of history. I don't know that we talk enough about because I think that it's so important for those, especially for those who understood how to use it. Washington knew how to use it sometimes, the Newburgh crisis or Newburgh conspiracy and the bringing out of his spectacles.
The old spectacles trick.
They really knew how to use the drama and the theatrical elements of the moment in a way that I think we've sometimes lost in politics
Of course,
today.
Jefferson is the master of political theater above all of them. All right, so I do think that some of that rhetoric that was so prominent back when we had the bicentennial of America in 1976, we live in an age a little bit too late for some of that today, and we're less likely to get into that kind of stand up and praise these great pronouncements of this period. I think this is a healthy thing. It's not the last word on this, of course. These things move all the time. Let's close with this recently posited idea by John Ragosta that Henry came out of retirement, sort of, called upon by George Washington when the Jeffersonians were perceived as dragging the country down.
Yeah, so his argument is that in response to the Alien and Sedition Acts, which were part of a broader policy agenda by the High Federalists in particular, the Arch Federalists, which included a very large standing army, which would enforce the Alien and Sedition Acts, especially against domestic opponents.
In Virginia.
In particular, and higher taxes to pay for said standing army. So higher taxes, standing army, these are things that Americans did not like in 1776. They did not like in 1796 or 1798 in this case. And so those three things were seen as this Federalist agenda that were quite unpopular. And in response, Jefferson and Madison wrote the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. And while Ragosta talks about this in his book, and I do as well, while the final version that actually passed Virginia did not have the word nullification in it,
Madison toned it down.
An initial version that was debated in the Virginia legislature did, because Jefferson inserted it without talking to Madison.
Meanwhile, in Kentucky, Jefferson has even more incendiary resolutions, so these are floating around.
But what's interesting is the Kentucky resolutions that Jefferson submitted, the Kentucky legislature toned down before they passed. So they kind of edit it for him. Then he inserts this
into Madison's.
They discuss it. A copy of it leaks and is spread around the world. And the Federalists lose their ever-loving minds because they basically say this is a declaration of rebellion. And it's seen as a declaration of rebellion. Madison gets them to tone it down, and the toned-down version is passed, but the damage is done because that language is introduced into the political lexicon and to the political conscience.
And a lot of people are saying this is what we always suspected about this Jefferson, that he's a radical.
Well, they didn't know at the time for sure that he was the one that wrote it. However, he was suspiciously not in Philadelphia with the federal government, and there were some Federalists that were saying, his absence feels very peculiar. So that response, because it was seen as so over the top by many people at the time, it kind of overshadowed in the immediate moment, the danger of the Alien and Sedition Acts, because it felt like both sides were
overreaction.
Both sides were sort of ramping up and being equally problematic. And so Washington calls upon Henry to come out and basically tamp down the threat of the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions in Virginia to try and ensure that Virginia stays loyal to the states. And Ragosta's argument is that Madison and Jefferson were chastened by how close they came to kind of destroying everything. I think they were, but I don't think they were because of the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. I think they were because of how the election of 1800 went. I think that They won, but it came so close to violence in the interim period while Congress was voting on who would be the next president, because, of course, there was the tie, and it was thrown to the House of Representatives.
37 ballots.
And the Virginia militia was on the border of the state, and the Pennsylvania militia was on the border of the state, and there was a mob outside the Capitol. And so they were literally teetering on the brink of the Constitution falling
Something
apart.
Bigger than January 6th. Some gigantic civil convulsion was threatened from both parties. And that is, I think, what scared them. So Henry comes sort of out of retirement, not literally, but he plays a role, and he basically says something like this: "I love this country. I wasn't a supporter of the Constitution. I still have grave doubts about it, but it was passed, it was ratified, it's the law of the land, and I'm going to abide by it, and I'm not going to put up with these attempts to undermine it by those people," by which he means Jefferson mostly and Madison partly. And some historians believe that that was a very important factor in the way the country survived that crisis. I think you and I both think maybe that's a bit exaggerated, but still.
I mean, I think it was important because it was someone of a similar persuasion of Jefferson and Madison saying this has gone too far, and so I think that voice mattered, but I don't think it was the thing that moved changed the balance. And the reason, one of the many reasons I think that is, Jefferson's famous first inaugural, "We are all Republicans, we're all Federalists," he didn't write it until after he actually won the vote. So he had 11 days between the time Congress decided he was going to be the next president and his inauguration, and he wrote it in those 11 days. So to me, that suggests that the events of February 1801 were what shaped that rhetoric.
We're out of time, Lindsay. Let me just ask you this. Patrick Henry, it seems to me like he has a special status in American memory, even greater than Samuel Adams, that somehow Henry is this really potent populist figure that somehow epitomizes what America is. He isn't born with a silver spoon in his mouth. He's not an aristocrat. He doesn't have giant landed estates, but he is a force of nature, and that his instincts were always the right ones. How do you assess him? Because I think he was overrated for a long time, and now I think he's underrated.
I agree that he is underrated. I think his instincts on everything, with the exception of maybe the Constitutional Convention, were correct, because I don't think the Articles of Confederation could be amended.
They couldn't be fixed.
So that's the one area where I think maybe his judgment was a little bit askew. But I think otherwise, he serves as an incredible moral compass for the Republic and its goals. And even, we didn't get a chance to talk much about his history with slavery. He acknowledged
67 slaves.
He acknowledged his own culpability. He was quite honest that, this is wrong, and I have been a part of it.
He explicitly says that slavery is incompatible with the principles of the Revolution. But he also says, and I don't mean to be cynical about this, he says it would be a real economic disruption for me if I didn't have my slaves.
Yeah. Well, he is an honest, and sometimes brutally honest, moral barometer of the Republic.
What a wonderful conversation.
Thank you.
You're off to, I guess, this place called Mount Vernon Presidential Library.
Indeed. I'm headed back to work at the Presidential Library. We were just chatting about we'll have to figure out a good subject, maybe in 2026 we'll find a good
I'd love to come. We'll
program.
do a 2-year residency. I'll just be there to plague you from outside. I'm off to Harper's Ferry.
Which is delightful.
On the Lewis and Clark Trail. It's been so great for us to meet at Christ Church here in Weems. I'd never been here. You've been here once. It's fabulous, and the Northern Neck is fabulous. I'm getting to see a lot of America, and some of it thanks to you. So we'll see you down the road. To all of you who are listening from Christ Church in Weems, Virginia, we'll see you next week for another important edition of Listening to America.